Alright, so this week brings us four other movies. We have three true stories and one movie that, while fictional, is probably true somewhere, so it still kind of fits here. Before we go into that, real quick, obviously I would have loved to have seen Bad Times at the El Royale today, but I didn't realize how long it is, so for scheduling purposes, I had to bump it to. It won't be. I'll see it next week, but as far as like doing this, probably be on the following week, as the weekend that Halloween comes out, which is next week. I'm gonna do like basically make it a horror theme thing, have like Hellfest and Tales from the Hood 2 on there and some other things. So then that following week will probably be like Bad Times at the El Royale, and I think Sorry to Bother You will be out by then, and probably the Johnny English movie, I guess. But so yeah, that's what we're looking at. So in the meantime, we'll take a look at these, starting with First Man. Obviously, Damien Chazelle's highly anticipated follow-up to La La Land, which, admittedly, I mean, I really love the whole space thing and the way it's taking off in movies again with stuff like Gravity and The Martian and Hidden Figures to an extent and stuff like that. But this one, I was more so just like, well, it's going to be an awards contender, and that's pretty much the main reason I'm even like somewhat into it from a distance. But I did figure that the whole story and the whole actually showing the moon landing through Damien Chazelle's vision would be something. Even if I wasn't like one of the most huge fans of La La Land, he still definitely got a visual thing going on throughout his movies. So, and I had initially heard, I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier awards videos, where I had heard word like a month ago where somebody saw a pre-screening and they said, don't get used to it being a Damien Chazelle movie because you had like Whiplash and La La Land. It's like those movies are super super flashy, and it's like this one doesn't have that the flashiness that those two do. It's more kind of standard. Well, whoever said that was lying because this is definitely something of his, and I certainly wouldn't call it not flashy. So, and I mean that in a good way, by the way. So, because obviously you look at this and you know the story and all that, and yeah, through another person's eyes, this could have been just another biopic. And maybe that was like, maybe I wasn't giving Chazelle enough credit when I talk about how I wasn't really, like, salivating for this movie before going into it. Because you hear it and you do just kind of imagine like a sort of biopic thing, but then you realize, well, through Chazelle's eyes, you're probably going to get something a little different. And he does deliver on that pretty much immediately, where we start in 1961 and it pretty much thrusts you immediately into this whole looking at all this stuff visually, where we get a bunch of point of view shots, a bunch of close-ups, and basically being right in it where Gosling is. Like I said, seeing many of these scenes like through his eyes, literally. So, and that's the thing though, is you realize that we're supposed to get to 1969. So when you see that it starts in 1961 and you realize like the 8-year gap here, your question going in is probably like, okay, this is a movie that's like 2 hours and 15 minutes or 2 hours and 20 minutes. How much of it is going to be the stuff that we like really, really want to see? Um, and once again, it really doesn't have a lot of the stuff that you may be expecting in regards to. I mean, I hate to say this because she's such a good actress, but it's like you sort of kind of dread the Claire Foy scenes because you know they're going to be the scenes that are like the downtime. She does what she can with that, but even so, sort of like the Kathleen Quinlan scenes in Apollo 13. It's like she does what she can, but it's not really the scenes you're here for. So there'll be a lot of that sprinkled throughout, but. So yeah, like I said, we get a lot of the point of view shots. Obviously, the sound design is going to be absolutely insane. It's like it's one of those cases where yeah, you should probably see this in the absolute best theater possible. Even if IMAX like deafens you, this might be worth it. And then like they really play up just how kind of brutal it is inside there, like how compacted and claustrophobic it is, and how you're basically being viciously jerked around as things take off and stuff like that, and it's really shown in a way that we haven't really seen yet. Like I said, even in the better of movies that have shown this stuff off, like Apollo 13 or something, it didn't quite show it so viscerally. Obviously, Ron Howard has much more of a sort of sensitive touch to pretty much most things he does, but Chazelle here was really gonna just get us in there and show this, and it's more like I've heard a lot of people say like don't show this movie to kids who want to be astronauts because it'll scare the living shit out of them into not doing it, and that's pretty accurate too, and it does obviously have another thing going in. Like after the opening scene, we learn about his very very young daughter who has cancer of sorts, it seems, and who quickly dies from this. And that pretty much sets the tone of his character through maybe not the movie itself, but his character specifically throughout the rest of the movie. Because you'll hear that Gosling's performance and the whole portrayal of the character might seem a bit like, cold to an extent. But the thing here is we see very quickly where that's coming from and how it's not just that, but it becomes worse sort of throughout, because one of the things this movie has going for it is how much it shows just like how much unfortunate death had to go into getting this mission off the ground. I wish I could have found another way to phrase that, but I couldn't. And the thing is he talks, or Claire Foy's talking about how, like in a line in passing, is how many funerals they've had to go to throughout this. And it's like, obviously, as the story goes on, it's like the closer and closer we get to this mission actually happening, that like the more and more funerals he's had to go to for these people that he's become friends with. Or at least relatively close to. Friends is probably a strong word, but because he can be very standoffish. But like I said, the whole daughter thing kind of sets that off from the beginning, and makes the character make sense even when he seems like he's at his lowest in regards to the way he interacts with people. Like at the beginning when he's like being interviewed for this, and the guy says he's being asked questions, and when it seems like he's getting ready to leave, one guy stops and says, "I just want to say I'm sorry about your daughter." And just in this cold, stone-faced way, he just asks, "Is that a question?" And it's like I said, it would be very easy to see him, and because he's the central character of this, the title character of this, that could maybe seem like the whole movie is this cold and emotionless. But that really didn't feel like that to me. It definitely felt like it was just, we had seen how the character got to this point, but the rest of the movie is certainly has a certain way to it that doesn't. There's not like an equal thing between those two, if people might be worried about that. There are cases like the portrayal of Buzz Aldrin, where I wasn't totally sure, because for starters I was psyched that Corey Stoll was playing him, because Corey Stoll in anything is going to be great, no matter how small the part. And for a while, I mean, you do hear things about people being dicks, and it's always nice when a movie actually goes out and, like, doesn't really sugarcoat the portrayal of people, because they often receive criticism for that. But it's like, it almost felt like they made Aldrin a little too one-dimensional, because it's like, for a while there, like, pretty much right before it goes to them, like, launching on the moon mission, pretty much all of Buzz Aldrin's lines are, like, heartlessly disrespecting the dead. And that's all he really says and does. And it's like, okay, I feel like even if maybe he said those things, or maybe he acted like that, there has to be more to that. But then at the same time, you have the argument of, this is like the Neil Armstrong story, and the other guys, like maybe if this was a Buzz Aldrin movie, that would be much more of a valid criticism of what they gave Corey Stoll to work with, but even so, I do think they could have done a little more with that, but I do understand that it's to really just focus on one character is all we need, and the others don't. They need to be present, and they do need to be believable, but we don't need to like go completely out of our way to make them, more, because then you risk the possibility of them being a bigger character than Neil Armstrong, which would not be good in this case. So that was fine, and then of course, like I said, you've got the Claire Foy stuff. She does have a couple of scenes that sort of, like, I'm currently not, like, predicting her or anything as supporting actress, but she does have a couple of scenes that kind of look like Oscar clips. One of which, after Zero Dark 30, it's like, for some reason, Kyle Chandler always seems to find himself on the wrong end of an actress's tirade and their potential Oscar clip. But there are also moments with her, though, where, like I said, you sort of dread her scenes. Not at all because of her or anything, but sort of the way they're placed, I guess. Because you obviously you expect the scenes of the home life. As cliche that they are, yeah, there is a purpose for them. But even though you understand there's a purpose for them, there are a lot of cuts back to her and what's going on with her in the middle of scenes to where you think, why do we need to see this now? Like, what bearing does this have on the much more interesting that's happening we keep cutting away from to show this? um, but like I said, you do understand like why it's there. It's just when they do it is sort of the issue. So that's kind of where the main problem comes in with her scenes. But like I said, it's not her at all, and it's not necessarily that they make the character just sort of the stay-at-home wife character. That's what she is. Like that's all she does get to do. But it does have like there's a moment with her and Kyle Chandler towards the end where he congratulates her after what's happened, and in an interesting way, you actually find yourself thinking she does kind of deserve it, to where you would think, at first you're not like, where did that come from, and like, but it does make sense, and she's able to bring that to life in enough of a way to where it doesn't like do too much harm to the movie, but so yeah, as far as when we get to like the really big, suspenseful, the big scenes, I guess you would call them the action scenes in a movie like this. It does really go into the sort of realistic feel of them. Obviously, that's a good thing, but it can also be sort of counterproductive at the same time. Like, when you see these scenes and it's like a lot of them are darkness, with Gosling sort of trying to fidget around in the dark, trying to fix the problems that are happening. And it's like you really can't see a whole lot of anything. And it's like, you see where the problem lies to where it's like, you want to praise it for the realism, because he's really is trying to work in the dark here, and that's one of the more terrifying aspects of it. But at the same time, as an audience member, when you can't really tell, you're like, you want to be invested in this and you want to be terrified by this, but it's like your mind's too busy trying to figure out what the hell you're even looking at to begin with, and that sort of takes over a little bit and sort of weighs down the otherwise great factor of how realistically, supposedly, this is being portrayed. Obviously, I can't say that for sure, but I would imagine. And yeah, the way that there is like that sort of sensory sort of thing going on where you do feel as disoriented and all the flashing, and the people in front of me looked really uncomfortable during the scenes, particularly the spinning scene. And I may have had to just sort of glance away and watch my peripherals once or twice to make sure I didn't get lightheaded. Which, once again, that's pretty effective if it can do that. But like I said, at the same time, the other half of this scene is your brain trying to work out, like, I'm not quite sure what all is happening, but you just kind of gotta trust it. And I don't know how I always feel about that. And there's also some cases where it feels like it can be a bit too much, especially in scenes that really don't call for it. I'm really sorry, but I have to come back to the Claire scenes. Because there's one scene in particular where, obviously they do the handheld thing quite a bit, but there's one scene in particular where it felt really unnecessary when she's going across the street to, I think it's Jason Clarke's wife, and it's just her crossing the street. Now, of course, this is kind of an emotional scene. Like, not like a big emotional scene, but within the context, it's an emotional scene. But the way they shoot this is just Claire Foy walking across the street to her, and, like, the camera is like this, like Paul Greengrass shot it. Just her walking across the street. That seems a bit much for stuff like that. And there are at least a couple of scenes where they do that, to where it's like they don't really have to keep this up consistently. If anything, it would make the scenes in space more disorienting if everything on the ground was, like, really sort of steady. But yeah, it's just like they kind of wanted to keep that going, even when they were just on the ground in the neighborhood. That was weird. But needless to say, this is all building towards the big moon landing thing, and everything leading up to that to get them there. Where we bring Lucas Haas into the equation as well, who gets maybe 2 lines, but even so. And yeah, and they do have a nice build up to this before they even leave, where, like, Kieran Hines gets a really good scene where he's, like, reading out this thing that's basically, like what's gonna go down, and what they're gonna do and say should the worst happen. And it's like half really pessimistic and like just really depressing, but then the other half of it is like saying how this will be like an achievement that we've never seen before. So there's like that optimism and that pessimism kind of come together in this scene, and of course, if you're gonna have somebody reading a line like that here in Hines, it's the perfect place to go. And then yes, we finally do get to the big moon landing thing, and it's kind of the big payoff. But the interesting thing about that is that you realize something. It's kind of something that occurred to me in retrospect, which is this continuous emotional level that they have going with the death of his daughter at the beginning, and how it pops up occasionally throughout the movie, pretty much as you would expect it to. But the way it comes full circle to bring much more emotion to the ending than you're ever expecting is really effective and really adds more to this scene. Like, the scene itself would be triumphant as is, but the fact that they are also able to put that big sort of emotional core at it is just really, really well done. And of course, the whole use of silence and audio that we're all so familiar with and all that, it all just comes together in this really big, enormously cinematic way. So it's like you kind of expect, like, in another director's hands, you sort of expect it to be a bit underwhelming, or like maybe in the same feel as the rest of the movie, but it feels like when we get to the moon landing scene that the movie has gone bigger than it already has. Like, we've seen all the places this movie's gone with the spinning around scene or whatever, all the training scenes and all that, the opening scene. But it feels like it just goes like as big as it possibly can the second we see the surface of the moon, and that's just really well done in like this really big way that, like I said, there's so much build up, and it's going to be such a huge deal. You're almost expecting to be underwhelmed when it actually happens, but Chazelle wouldn't let that happen. So, and they threw the controversy in there about the whole not showing the planting of the flag thing, and it's like, I just felt like that was kind of a lose-lose, because it's like, if you don't show them planting the flag, everybody's going to get all pissed off and say, why leave out something so big and monumental and historic? But at the same time, you damn well know that if they did show the planting of the flag, this movie would forever be branded an America fuck yeah movie. And it's like, because you can't show the American flag once in a movie without people complaining that it's like being way, way too overly patriotic, like a Michael Bay movie or something. It's like, you know that would have happened. So I'm not sure exactly what they said the reasoning was, but that's the way I imagine it. That's, like, if I made that same choice, that would be my reasoning, is it would be overcome with this identity of being this, we're America, fuck you movie or something, but it doesn't come off like that, and it wouldn't have if they'd actually done it either. I doubt it. So that was just dumb. That was even a controversy, but I suppose I get it from, like, a historic perspective and all that, but it is what it is. Like I said, if you know how people would have reacted one way or the other, either way works. So whatever. So that's pretty much where I stand on that. So much like La La Land, I certainly understand why people might see this as like a huge, enormous deal and a movie that they just go absolutely crazy for. I do think it's very good, but I do think there's some things that bring it down too. But overall, especially that whole ending, it does go on a little further than it probably should. Like, the moon probably should have been our ending, but there's a couple of other scenes that are fine. One of them I already mentioned, but yeah, so that's where I stand on that. So let's go on to another true story with 22 July. I'm assuming that's how we're setting this title. Paul Greengrass's Netflix movie. I didn't know about this until, like, Ashley brought it up in one of the awards videos, that not only had Paul Greengrass made another movie, but it was a Netflix movie. And despite all the bad things I've said about Netflix recently, Paul Greengrass is always going to get me hyped regardless. Like, I wasn't even thinking about the fact that it was a Netflix movie. I was only identifying it as a Paul Greengrass movie. And also, I really hate to say this, but I didn't really know about the events of this movie. I had to do the research before and after watching it to learn about it. And it is another one of those cases where Greengrass seems to have this bad luck where he makes a movie and another movie comes out that's pretty much the same thing. Like when he made Captain Phillips, a hijacking came out around the same time. And then now that he's released this, the same story was told by an actual Norwegian director that I think it was at the Berlin Film Festival or something. It got a lot of acclaim. So yeah, once again, he's got a little companion piece to go with his own movie as well. So, and yes, apparently this was a terrorist attack in 2011 in Norway. I'm sure I'm one of the only people that didn't know this, so I'm just saying what you already know. But for the sake of argument, it was apparently the deadliest attack in Norway since World War II. And it was one damn dude. And it was like 77 people died and like over 200 ended up injured. And it started off with just a bombing, and then while all the chaos was going on, he went over on a ferry and started shooting up this camp with this well-connected family there in particular, basically just as a political stance. And yeah, so and it's one of those things also where, and I guess it was so big, like there was a survey where it was like 1 in 4 Norwegian people say that they know somebody that was affected by this attack in like one way or another, which is a jarring amount. And obviously, with that on the table, it is one of those things where you wonder, like how to be tactful in regards to making a movie like this, which Greengrass has shown, in my opinion, has shown that he can do. But I'm sure there'll be people who watch like United 93 or something and think that just in general the movie's existence might be in poor taste or something. Or I know some people thought that they like overplayed like the Captain Phillips as a character in relation to who he was in real life. I don't really remember much about that, but even so, his approach here, and once again, it all comes down to just how the person sees it and whether or not you think this is a good example or not. But the way Greengrass made this movie sort of reminds me a lot, actually, of Peter Berg's approach to Patriots Day, which I called the best movie of 2016, because I love that he was able to show the events as they are without seeming like he was overdoing it, without showing them with the realism, or showing them with the realism that they need, without making it some, like, not using, like, movie violence to do so, making it feel very real, but also having enough focus on the victims themselves. Now, unlike Patriots Day, which I thought was skillful in the way it used the victims, it's sort of like a reverse, really, of that movie, because here, Patriots Day, it began and it ended with the victims, and the middle was the violence and the investigation of all that. But this one starts with the attack itself, and then goes back and forth between the investigation and the victims themselves. And there's a bunch of subplots branching off this to cover all these different things that this goes into. It is a very long movie at about 2.5 hours, but with how much is going on, that runtime pretty much makes sense. Because you've got, we start off with the terrorist himself, who is an actor that, not only is this not his first movie in this setting, it's also not his first movie whose title was A Date. He was the main guy in also August 31st, which I believe he shares a first name with himself, along with both characters in that movie and this movie as well, weirdly enough. And he was also in Personal Shopper last year, but his particular portrayal here is another one of those cases of how exactly do you portray somebody like this in a movie without either making him just this, like I said, just sort of movie monster without there being a particular feel of reality from him. Given just the way that he spoke and the way that he was towards all this, and how remorseless he was, it would be very easy to just make it seem like they're playing up how evil he is. But yeah, there's actually, like, it's really hard to word, so I can't imagine how hard it was for them to actually portray this. but it's like they do make him feel real without going into that territory, where they do make it feel like he's this, you know, remorseless monster of sorts. Yet somehow it doesn't feel like he's gone into the movie territory of existing. It does feel like you realize this is a real person that really did and said all of this, and just feels this absolute, practically nothingness towards it. Not even, actually worse than nothingness. Feels like what he's doing is right and what he should be doing, and it's just really, really touchy all the way around to make this, and the fact that Greengrass had the confidence to be able to tackle all of these different things in the way that he does. Like I said, showing off, like, it almost seems inappropriate to talk about it. I had this problem with Patriots Day, too, among many other movies, like United 93. Not to just fall on one example, but the whole... It almost feels inappropriate to approach this movie as a thriller, because of, you know, the reality. But the thing is just the way they portray the cold-bloodedness of it, is just really effective in a way that... You're glad that the movie was able to reach that effect, but you also wish it hadn't, because so you wouldn't have witnessed it. Like, there's a particular moment of cold-bloodedness when he... Because the thing about it is how just weirdly he was able to take on this identity in order to get him here. This whole just putting on, like, a police costume and just making everyone believe with his just absolute calmness. Like, when he shows up to the ferry, you would never in a billion years suspect that this dude just blew something up and killed a bunch of people. And that this is going to lead to mass murder in, like, 30 seconds' time. The way he just calmly comes up and says he needs the ferry, and then once he gets there, after the shooting's already broken out, when he goes up to that window, these people, they're in, like, this cabin of sorts, trapped in here. And he walks up to the windows and just going right back into cop mode, says, you know, get away from the windows, I'm a cop, we're dealing with the situation. And then just goes right around into the entrance and takes advantage of the fact that he has them trapped. Which is shot in as tasteful of a way as it probably could have been, where we see the outside, but we hear him, you know, say the words like, you're all gonna die today, stuff like that. And it's a really hard first 45 minutes. The whole thing is just like this emotional powerhouse, but this first, the whole attack scene itself is going to be sort of like the Private Ryan scenario, where it's like, you feel like you're okay if you can get through the opening act, but you still not maybe right off then either. But then stuff where it's like, like I said, it almost seems like it would be almost too movie-like when he's being interrogated and he's basically, like, just as if, you know, he's has the right to receive assistance that he hasn't received yet. He said, after all this, after killing 77 people, he has the goal to say, I really need to get this cut on my finger looked at. I cut it on somebody's skull and nobody's looked at it yet. And he just says it with just this... the word that comes to mind is arrogance, but that obviously doesn't seem strong enough. But also what I'm getting at there is the performance here is just unreal. In, like, for the actor, a positive way, I mean that, of course. But then there's also, and I can understand also the complaint, which I've heard at least once, about the courtroom scene, when there's a whole conflict where he's gonna be in court and wants to give his whole sort of outlook here, and the outrage came out that it's like, why would this dude get to say, why would we give this dude this platform to spout this stuff? And sure enough, some people throw that criticism at the movie itself because the movie has that scene in it, thereby giving him the platform again. I can understand that in particular also, but it does sort of... Number one, it is showing the events as they occur, which is all you can really ask from a movie like this, but also, like I said, just to sort of give you that... I know, it's that point of view that you don't want, but at the same time, from a movie's perspective, like, if you're gonna make the movie, you kind of have to go there, otherwise what else are you doing? So... And there is definitely, you can definitely see the sort of balance here that they have to find, where it's like you've either got to go for it or you've got to hold back. And if you're holding back, why is this being made? Why are you telling this story if you're gonna, fall back or whatever? But that's the thing, though, is like I was talking about, not just the violence feels really sort of real and not movie like, but the way that people speak and all that. Like this whole subplot when we have the kid that's been shot and was almost killed and still has bullet fragments in his brain that could kill him at any second. And when he has to go into that courtroom, it could have been like this really big movie scene. You know exactly the courtroom drama scene that's in every movie with a court scene in it ever could have been what we saw. But they really stick with the reality of it. They don't make it big. All the emotions feel absolutely sincere without having to do the big thing. And when he's explaining, when he has to be in the same room as the dude, you just feel all of that in this way that you don't feel in other movies that portray this similar material. And it might seem like it has too many subplots in it at first, but it does. Not only does it find a balance, but everything feels necessary. Because, and like, really focusing on this one dude in regards to all the different directions this takes him. And you do think, well, with all these victims and all these people affected, does it seem a bit too narrowed down to just show the effect really zeroing in on one person? But that is one of those cases where you do have a lot to work with, and just zeroing in on this one dude does just kind of tell you, not just his own personal story, but just the general, gives you an idea of the general suffering and ultimate hopeful recovery. Like I said, even if through this one character, it's still pretty much, you can feel it, like, throughout, where you can imagine all the other, there are other characters they do show, but this is the one that's really, basically, like I said, gets an entire subplot, pretty much. And it does, and another great performance from him, also, so that's, but then there's also, the lawyer, as well, the dude that basically had to, that he personally called on to represent him, and pretty much by law he had no choice to, and how he inevitably had to deal with threats, and like how could he do that and all that stuff. That's something I probably would have liked to have seen a little more of, as well as all the stuff where, obviously eventually they also touch on the people that it turns out knew that this attack was coming and didn't do anything about it. Where it's like this, like I said, this story has so many directions it needs to go in and so much it has to cover. And it's one of those cases where you say, well, maybe they could have cut this or this, but it's like, all this stuff is really crucial to this. And like I said, even if you want to look at it as like that one particular victim, and it's like, he's basically representing like everybody that went through all this every time he's on screen, not just necessarily his own. Even though that is a powerful story by itself, like I said, it feels more like a representation of just the suffering and recovery in general. So, and yeah, once obviously this is all leading to a big court scene, not just how I felt about the reality of the two of them, but also just in general, like, there could have been a real preachiness here, or it turned into like a message movie or like a political message movie. I mean, obviously that's just going to be in there because that's the material, but, I mean, as far as a way to where it feels like the movie's trying to go beyond what really happened to say its own thing, rather it seems to be just showing you the events themselves, and I think that's kind of really important to the portrayal of this, so to make it feel as real as possible and not, because the more movie-like it feels, the more sort of it's going to dampen what actually happened and what the real story is, so... and as far as I know, you can count on that from Greengrass for the most part. So, and not just, effectively telling true stories, but just making movies in general that grab you the way movies like United 93 and Captain Phillips do. I don't think this is really... I honestly wouldn't... as much as I like this, I wouldn't say it's even near the level of something like Captain Phillips or United 93, but... because it does, like, I mean, even though I've just built up that we have all these different things to go, and it's like, what can you really cut? It does still feel like it's, long. Like, you can feel its length. Like, probably if you really, really look into the depths of it, there can be things that are taken out to make things feel a bit more smooth, while also not having to take out anything, like, extremely crucial. Like I said, that's difficult with how many crucial things are here, but overall, yeah, so like I said, I don't feel like I can really go into it like in this big profound way, being that I unfortunately didn't even know about this until shortly before I saw the movie, but um, yeah, like I said, it's a Paul Greengrass movie, and that's always going to be something that grabs my attention. So, and this will only further to continue that. And holy shit, Netflix actually put out something that's worth seeing. It's unbelievable, isn't it? So, there's that. But once again, though, it kind of goes against what seems to be the Netflix vibe of, hey, you can just put something on Netflix and just, have it on in the background and relax and all that shit. And it's like, this isn't really that movie at all. But surely most people know that by this point, so hopefully that mistake is not made. Let's go on to our third true story, another biopic, and don't worry, he won't get far on foot. Once again, though, I do say biopic, but I do kind of struggle to say that because it does... Well, the thing here is, with Gus Van Sant, you're typically can't really count on getting, like, that traditional biopic vibe. Like, of course he made, like, Milk and stuff like that, but even then, Milk really feels like, I don't know how else to put this. Milk feels like a movie that just happens to be the true story of all those people, but it doesn't feel like it gets into all those, cliche areas that you expect biopics to go, which I really appreciate about that movie. And then on top of that, you have the fact that this stars Joaquin Phoenix, and it's like, you hear the story, an alcoholic paraplegic gets into a car wreck, and then eventually finds solace in not just his AA meetings, but also drawing these cartoons, and it's like, this has Oscar bait written all over it, just when you look at the vague outline, but when you see that not only is Gus Van Sant making it, but Joaquin Phoenix is the star of it, who goes in all the opposite directions of Oscar bait movies, you feel like you have something a bit more special here than just the usual, what you'd expect from this. And just from the title alone, you know that you can expect a sort of, like, biting sense of humor that might... The whole idea of his cartoons was the whole, people either love them or they'll be super offended by them, and it's like the title alone completely spells that out for you. So, with that, I do say that Van Sant doesn't do, like, traditional biopics, and he does sort of start that off. Well, it feels like it's going to be the beginning, but then it is kind of throughout. This movie's timeline is all over the place. So if that's something that usually bothers you, this movie will be excruciating, because it's like, we have scenes that are clearly before his accident and after it, and then we have scenes, like, before he went to AA and afterward, or, like, during it. And all four of these sections are just all mixed up. And it's like, you spend a lot of the movie trying to figure out where you are in time and using the context clues, which, like I said, if you're not used to movies like that or whatever, you're gonna, like, it's the entire first half hour, you feel like you're trying to put the pieces together, and that early, like, being the first half hour, will probably put a lot of people off if they can't grasp it immediately. And I know I had some difficulty, but it does sort of, like, even, there are even still sometimes towards the end where I was kind of surprised to learn where we were in the timeline. But overall, like I said, if you can get enough of a grasp of it, or at least the scenes are working individually, they'll still add up in an effective way, and it won't matter. But going on that, it does, like when you see something like this, you do think, if it's going to be a sort of Oscar bait type movie, you're probably going to expect a lot of, like, I mean, scenes that we do get. Like, there'll be scenes of Joaquin Phoenix screaming, falling out of his chair, or going on drunken tirades, being at the absolute lows, doing the whole, getting the physicality down perfectly, stuff like that. But the thing here also is that it's also going to have, like, those heartwarming, sort of inspirational moments that you'd expect from biopics. But the thing is how the movie really accomplishes those. Like, it doesn't stray away from those, and they're here, but maybe I wouldn't say like not as blatantly, but the way they're able to pull this off. Like, for instance, when we see Callahan so miserable throughout most of it, the scenes where Phoenix like finds happiness, like in these brief moments, like with Rooney Mara, or at the groups, or talking to Jonah Hill or whatever. The scenes with Jonah Hill in particular also seem to sort of find an interesting middle ground between, like, there's a bit of a dreariness or a pessimism in there, but there's also like hope also. Um, and they can be depressing, or they can be inspiring, like from one moment to the next. So that's an interesting way to play. But then they just throw those things in there that just ultimately work. Like that seem like they're small, or what you would expect, but at the same time, it's like the moment early on when he's at one of his meetings, and obviously he's gonna feel out of place and he's gonna be angry and all that. But then there's a moment when he's like listening to Jonah Hill talk for the first time, and we see like a smile on his face, like he almost immediately feels like he belongs. And then there's another similar scene later that's probably even more effective. And you realize that they do find enough of a balance here that it's not going to go into like that cheesy biopic territory, at least in a big way. And it'll maintain some sort of way of... It's like it's avoiding that, but usually when movies try to go against the cliches we expect from their genre, it's like you can usually see them like actively avoiding it, but here it feels a lot more natural, and then it's just kind of going in the directions it feels it needs to, and it just happens to be avoiding the cliches we might expect, which is really refreshing and nice. So, and then we do also get some of these scenes, like, scenes that could have been akin to, like, the early scenes in Born on the 4th of July, when Tom Cruise realizes he can't walk. These scenes in the hospital where it's like this, there's almost a darkly... Oh yeah, there's no almost about it. There is a darkly comedic element about it throughout. And sometimes in, like, these almost unreal sort of ways, to where, like, we're not sure if, like, what we're looking at is what's actually happening, or, like, him seeing it in this exaggerated fashion in his distress. Like, when he first gets in the accident, and he wakes up, and he's paralyzed, and his doctor is, like, painfully nonchalant about it. And so the way they play with stuff like that, I think really brings out the movie's identity in a nice way. But then we also have really nice scenes that are in, feel like they're in, like, the same vein, but instead of the doctor, now it's Rooney Mara that comes in and is, like, this sort of therapist to him, and it brings a much more lighter vibe to it, and a much more optimistic vibe to it. And we see him much happier than we do in the other scenes with the other characters. And it's really those interactions that bring the movie out. Like, it's great to see Phoenix doing the physicality and the drunkenness and all that other stuff, which he does very effectively, but interestingly enough, and you don't usually expect this from Joaquin Phoenix performances because he has such a grasp on what he does, he's usually like the whole show, or at least to an extent. Stuff like The Master, obviously, he shares it with Hoffman and Adams and the like, but for the most part, he can really just be the absolute center of a movie. But this movie really thrives when he's interacting with the other characters, and you'll see people come and go, like Jonah Hill and Jack Black and all them. The dude that takes care of him. And yeah, Jonah Hill does some very interesting stuff here. I've noticed the interesting thing is that I was initially going to say something that was false, but then I caught myself, and that was that you see Jonah Hill, especially when you see him with, like, the beard and the Jesus hair and all that, you sort of, because it's Jonah Hill, you sort of have your mind set for a comedic performance, and he always surprises you. But I realized in the middle of thinking that it's not true. Like, Jonah Hill has come so far at this point between, like, even if it was comedic, the stuff that he did in War Dogs, or, and, like, The Wolf of Wall Street, even, is a comedic performance, but the fact that he's able to go into those roles so incredibly headfirst, and really become them, and then you've got stuff like Maniac we just saw, and it's like, he's actually so good at this point that, no, I don't really immediately expect comedy anymore when I see him. Even like I said, even though some of his best roles and best performances come from performances that are like 75% still comedy, um, he's really able to do something dramatic like without you even really thinking about it anymore. At least for me. And when we see him, like I said, there's still like definitely a biting sense of humor to not just the whole movie, but his character in particular. In this sort of obviously he's got to have an optimism because of his job here and who he's dealing with, but there's still definitely this odd sort of I don't even know how to describe it, but there's definitely something here that's sort of there's like a kind of a darkness in this character, but it's very very subtle. Like a lot of times we see him, it's like he sort of looks like an Elizabeth Taylor character, where we'll just see him like in long white robes laying across his bed, and these bedrooms that are like big and gold and like floral. But there's really just sort of something, like I said, it almost feels like there's a darkness in this character that's like vaguely there, but we do see it, and it does sort of come out in 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 ways that eventually make sense. Um, so he handles that really well. And then there's also, obviously, Jack Black only has technically two scenes, I guess, if you consider his first scene one long extended one, where he was the one that was driving the car that crashed, that ultimately put Phoenix in his position, and he didn't even, he like had like a scratch on him or something, that's about it. And then there's the whole thing of, we're kind of expecting this will come back around and there'll be a confrontation and all that. Um, and even then, it does seem like we're expecting something that doesn't quite happen out of this, but in a good way. Um, but that, at the same time, though, it does, like, even though it does have its sense of humor in a really good place, and it is trying to balance a lot, it does feel like it doesn't quite have a hold throughout. Like I said, I do think the timeline is a bit more fractured than it probably should be. Like I don't think the timeline should be as confusing as it is sometimes, and I don't know what that adds to it. Um, but you do have this other moment towards the end where it's a montage of him doing his forgiveness, where he goes to each person and forgives them for whatever, or asks for forgiveness for what's ever happened, or forgives the people that may have wronged him or whatever. Um, and this almost feels like it could have been an entire second half. Now, mind you, that probably would have been predictable and would have had way too many Oscar-y scenes or whatever. But I still feel like they could have done a lot more with this than they ended up doing. And it's like, for what it is, it feels like it should be the big payoff of the movie, and it's like they really rush through it with just a montage. And the scene that we do get, the scene we're waiting the whole movie for, is effective. And like I said, especially since you may envision this scene in your head, especially with the way Black's character was when we first met him, may not be the person that we're expecting to see when he comes back around, but it still feels like it's maybe a little too short. I know you also kind of it's commendable that they're able to accomplish what they do in the short runtime this scene has, but at the same time, it's like I really would have liked to have seen them do a little more. And you can say that about a lot of things, really, because the way it bounces around like that, there's like so many things in there to where you feel that about. But the way it keeps sort of cutting back and forth, it's like it only gives us bits and pieces of something that could have been one piece of something greater, but we're only stuck with that one piece. That's all we've got. And it may it may almost leave you with like a better feel of the movie than you think, because you're imagining what these scenes could have gone even farther into, but then you realize in retrospect the movie doesn't do that. So that's kind of a problem. But yeah, and it has so much to pack into it. It's got the alcoholism. It's got him dealing with being a paraplegic. It's got him overcoming the obstacles that come with that kind of thing. There's the Rooney Mara stuff. There's the discovering cartoons as his outlet and how people react to that. This movie has a lot of stuff in it. And like I said, maybe because there's so much, maybe that's why they thought the fractured timeline would help a little bit, and it doesn't make it feel like it could have easily, because all these different things are happening, it could have been one of those movies that's like, well, this thing happens, then this thing happens, and so on, and that's the usual biopic style that we're sick of at this point. But like I said, they may have utilized that a little too much, and it just makes it feel really sort of jumbled. Um, and it but like I said, that whole biting sense of humor does add another layer to it that's usually missing from movies like this, and really goes along with the character himself, the real guy himself. Um, but yeah, overall, like I said, it does feel like they're dealing with too much, and they rush a bit too much also. But there's still something in here that's like worth seeing. One thing that I really would love to see that we'll sadly never get to is apparently when they were making Good Will Hunting, Robin Williams is the one that brought the John Callahan story to Gus Van Sant. And he was kind of hoping to play the part. And it's like, that could have been really, really good, but I'm not quite sure how that never panned out. And sadly, we'll never know. But yeah, that's one of those movies where it'll always be like, obviously, Walking Phoenix is great. And the movie does do a great job with a lot of things, but it does sort of leave you with that. Not only what could it have been with what the movie offers but doesn't always deliver on, but what it could have been with another actor as well. There's so many like what ifs going into this movie that it sort of leaves you with that more so than the stuff that's really good. But yeah, but it's still worth seeking out anyway. So especially if you're a Phoenix fan. So all right, we're gonna end on Leave No Trace. This is the apparently Deborah Granick made Winter's Bone 8 years ago, obviously, and then the only thing she's done between this and that is like a documentary, and that's it. And everybody's sort of been waiting for her next movie, and then just this modest little thing just comes out and like blew everybody away apparently. So this is one of those movies where it's been out since I think it came out like very early in the summer, maybe right before the summer, and it's been out on DVD since the end of last month, and through all this time, it has still managed to keep it 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. So take that for what you will. And it does feel like one thing that sort of I couldn't seem to get out of my head throughout at least the opening 20 minutes or so here was that, and maybe it's because Granny's been absent for so long or whatever, but like it almost felt more like a Kelly Reichardt movie, who made like Wendy and Lucy and Meek's Cut Off and Certain Women, Night Moves, and it's like it feels more like it should be. It almost feels like you forget that this is actually her style, and it almost feels like she's been gone too long, and now it just feels like she's mimicking, even though she's doing what she's always done. It's a very conflicting feeling, but that's just the first thing that I noticed going into this. But obviously, when it begins, if you haven't really looked much into it, which I didn't, you're going to have a lot of questions as you're watching it, which obviously, as long as it continues to make the movie intriguing, is a very good thing. So, we're watching Ben Foster and this young girl, who's clearly his daughter, because she calls him dad, and they seem to just live in the wilderness. Like, they have tents, they drink rain, they have like a little bit of propane that they cook with, and they find all the shit around, building fires, all that stuff. And to some people it might seem like it's just like maybe a father and daughter out camping or whatever, but I immediately kind of assumed that they'd been doing this for a very, very long time. And like this is how they had been living for God knows how long, and it's like, because she seems so, like she knows so much of what he knows also, and she seems so well taught in this, and it's like, has this been since she was a lot younger? How long has this been going on? How far out are they? How far away from civilization are they? And the answers come surprisingly quickly. Because it's like, I mean, at first I did sort of have like a bit of cynicism towards it, because it was like, I mean, first off, you just get those little hints of character, like they say thank you to each other for like every little thing, and it's like it sort of makes you. That's where I kind of started to wonder. It's like, is this in general how he raised her or whatever? And then you sort of like the cynicism look I sort of got towards it was like, if you're one of those people that either didn't like to begin with or is sick of those movies where it's like, you know, those indie movies where people just kind of do shit in silence. especially outdoors. And you can just sort of hear critics from miles and miles away talking about praising endlessly the authenticity of all this. And it's like, it's sort of, you can't quite put your finger on it, but you're pretty sure you've seen this movie many times before. You're gonna have a problem with it at first. And like, I didn't like condemn it or anything. I just couldn't help but notice that, yeah, the authenticity's there, but it did feel very much like so many movies like this, like Kelly Reichardt movies, for instance, have been authentic in this same way. And so it didn't, like, immediately grab me just based on that, like it seems to have so many other people. On top of the fact that there's not much in the way of score either. Like, at the beginning, there's a little something, but for the most part, it's just sort of them doing this, and you just get, like, it's... The immersive thing is happening. You've got all the sounds, like, just every individual thing you would hear in the wilderness you can hear, and it does set the scene quite well. But even so, like I said, you do have all those questions, but then it's revealed quite quickly that this really hasn't been going on very long at all. If anything, I think it's like supposed to be a few days or something. And the reveal to this is like so almost humorously sudden, where it's like they seem to be running out of supplies, and you're like, oh, what do they do in this case? Like, how have they survived this long? And Ben Foster just says, well, we're out of stuff, we gotta go to the store now. And it just really kind of catches you off guard, and sure enough, they just walk right in, they go to the store, he has money, they buy stuff, and then they go right back to where they were. Sort of bouncing around a little bit for the most part, setting up camp and kind of staying in that place, in this sort of off-the-grid way. And then, at this point, you have even more questions. But then the plot takes... You sort of come to the conclusion early, it's like, is this what the movie is in its entirety? But then no, like, it's only maybe 25 minutes in or so, and then it's got some curves up its sleeve and goes in different directions when they have to be... They're taken back to civilization, and we go from there. And you have all these different questions, like maybe, like, you're asking yourself, how shady is he? But once again, these are things like, most of the questions you have are answered surprisingly quickly, to where, like, in the first half hour or so, you know a lot more than you probably thought you would when it started. Like, for instance, yeah, the thought went through my head, because if you've seen enough movies or you read enough about real life, it's like, you start to wonder if there's a shadiness to him, and what exactly their relationship is. But then, like, immediately, a social worker asks her if she's ever been touched inappropriately, and the way she shuts it down leaves you with, like, no doubt that this is a strictly very sort of innocent father-daughter relationship, if he might possibly be endangering her with this sort of thing. But at the same time, there is, like, a certain equality that they have going on between them, like, and this is, obviously this is building up, I think her name is Thomasin McKenzie, who plays the girl, and she's getting talked up quite a bit as, like, one of the best performances of the year. I'm not that passionate about her performance as those people, but I do understand where it's coming from, particularly the way she's able to not only stand on her own next to Ben Foster, but also how she's able to, this equality thing I'm talking about, where it's like, he seems to have this real sort of authoritative way about him, and how he's the one, like I said, it feels like he's the teacher and she's the student when we're initially watching them. But then we quickly learn that they're on an even keel here, where there's a particular moment when he's trying to get a fire going while she's making the food, and he can't get the fire going, so she says, well, I'm using the propane. And he's like, you can't do that because we're running low. And up to this point, you kind of expect her to say something like, yes, sir, and, like, cower and just wait. But she says, no, I'm hungry, I'm using the propane. And he just kind of has to deal with that. And then that's when we realize it's like, it's not necessarily the what he says goes thing. There is a whole sort of camaraderie here in what they do. And that makes it really interesting, in the fact that that's the direction her character has to go. It means the performance has to be even that stronger. Because it would probably be a lot easier to play the person that's, with an actor as experienced and great as Ben Foster, to just sort of be the one that seems like the student to him. But the fact that she has to be his equal is like a whole other scenario. And then the whole, as it goes on, and she like has to deal with what direction she's going to go, because obviously as she's getting older, maybe following him, it turns out, is not going to be the best scenario for her, and she has to like, there's this combating inside her to where it's like she has to be her own person, but she also very much has a loyalty that she seems to, I don't know if she feels like she owes him that, or just in general that like that's just the way it should be, is that she has that certain sort of loyalty to him. But as she's also trying to branch out into her own thing also, in this whole sort of crossroads that she finds herself at, as her life gets a bit more and more unpredictable in regards to where they're going to end up exactly. And another way they handle this is when we see, like I said, there's not much reveal. The stuff that's revealed about their character really is, a lot of it's in passing, like the fact that he's a war veteran. I mean, of course, we can probably see that in his, survival techniques, but it's only actually mentioned out loud, like, maybe once, quickly. So you kind of just have to watch them and figure it out. But then when other characters come in, like the social workers or the cops or whatever, it's like, when you look at all of them, really, there are so many different ways they could have taken this in regards to making an antagonist in here somewhere. Because you see the cops and the social workers, like, pull them out of their home and say, like, you're doing that illegally and all that stuff. You can, stay in these places, and they gotta get split up for their own individual testing and all that. And it's like, it could have been very, very easy to make the social workers, like, the antagonists in this, the ones that are, like, soullessly trying to break them apart and take their livelihood away from them and all that. But no, like, everybody in this, like, this is a movie about everything being done the hard way, yet everybody in the movie has, like, good intentions. So there's, like, a really interesting balance there in regards to that, where you would expect that there's going to be somebody that's trying to somehow stop people from living the life that they want or they need, really. But they don't, because even when you look at the two of them, you would think, like, maybe with her reaching a crossroads in life, this is going to be antagonistic towards him and what he feels they need to do. Or it could be, Foster could have been seen as this antagonist towards her, trying to keep her in a place that maybe she doesn't want to be, maybe that she can branch off further into and doesn't need this anymore, and doesn't need to stay attached to him like this. But they keep it all very much, like, everybody's very human, everybody's just trying to do the best for everybody. Which is a really interesting outlook to look at these characters, and the fact that they don't force any sort of, like, conflict on them that's not already present from the get-go. So that's really strong, too. And then, of course, obviously they end up with, Dale Dickey eventually shows up. It's one of those cases where it's like, not just because it's Devin Granick and, the Winter's Bone connection and all that, but it's like, it's one of those cases where you're just watching the movie and you're like, God, the only thing this movie's missing is Dale Dickey. And, like, as soon as you think that, she appears. It's like calling Beetlejuice or something. So, yeah, so all that stuff does come together nicely, and it does feel like this nice, modest movie that does all this stuff I mentioned perfectly. But with that said, I didn't really feel a huge, like, emotional impact. Like I said, I don't know if it was maybe too low-key. I don't really think so, because I really kind of admired the way it sort of stayed consistent in its tone throughout. Obviously, there's going to be trouble around and maybe a near-death scenario once or twice to heighten it a little bit. But overall, as engrossing as it can get, and as great as the performances are, I sort of just walked away from it thinking that it's very good, but I didn't feel particularly, like, really, really carried away with it. But I did admire a lot of things about it. So, for me, it's really just kind of one of those. So, that's pretty much where I go from here. So I think that's going to be it for this. So like I said, next week's going to be Halloween and a bunch of other horror movies, and then next week, the week after that, we'll talk about Bad Times at the El Royale and Sorry to Bother You and stuff like that. So, and then the horror versus is going to keep going, which I have to do as soon as I turn the camera off and back on. So, yeah, so until all that stuff, that's it.